There is a plant that used to grow in the gardens of the biblical world, and interestingly, almost no one talks about it today. You won't hear it mentioned in the Sunday sermon. It doesn't appear in the famous paintings of the Last Supper. It's also not usually taught in theology schools, but it was there. It grew in the same gardens where Jesus walked. It appeared in the homes he visited. There it was part of the traditions of his people, and it was recorded in some of the oldest texts of humanity as a symbol of something very particular: protection. Protection that, according to those traditions, was not a human invention, but something that heaven itself had set aside for mankind. And there is a specific night in a specific garden, surrounded by darkness and everything that was about to happen, where there are indications that Jesus stopped outside, not as a botanist, not as an herbalist, but as someone who perfectly understood what that plant represented within the spiritual language of his people. Now, before we continue, I need to clarify something important for you. This video is not about plant magic, it's not about esoteric rituals, nor about strange superstitions that someone found on an obscure blog online. It's about something much deeper, about the way the divine encoded principles of spiritual protection within nature itself, and about how those principles, which are still there, available to anyone who understands them, can completely change the way you go through the toughest seasons of your life. Because there are times when the attack feels all too real, moments when everything you build seems to fall apart, seasons when people you love drift away without explanation, days when your inner peace starts taking hits from angles you can't even identify. And in the midst of all that, there's a question that almost no one dares to ask. A question that Jesus interestingly answered with his own life. What did the Creator place in nature to protect those who seek him? What did he place? Let's explore that question. Or stay until the end, because what comes next could completely change the way you understand divine protection. Today we're going to dive into a topic that connects the spiritual world with the natural world in a way that very few dare to explain with real depth. We're going to talk about the plant that biblical texts and the tradition of the Holy Land associate with divine protection, about its presence in the scriptures, and what Jesus taught about the relationship between nature and the spiritual world, and, most importantly, how to apply those principles in your life today. And before we continue, let me tell you something. If at any point in this video you feel that something you hear connects with what you're experiencing right now, write it in the comments. Because this community exists for a very simple reason, so that no one has to go through these difficult seasons alone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, maybe this is a good time, because what we're building here week after week isn't just content. It's a spiritual guide for real life. All right, let's get started. To understand why a plant can have an authentic spiritual meaning, we first need to understand something fundamental: how he saw nature. Jesus didn't teach in the abstract. He taught with things people could touch, see, and recognize. He used wheat and tares to explain the struggle between good and evil. He used the mustard seed to talk about the power of faith. He spoke about the vine and the branches to explain the connection with the divine. And he spoke of living water to describe the Spirit. For Jesus, nature was not separate from spiritual life. It was the language through which the divine communicated deep truths to those who had eyes to see. And this way of seeing the world didn't start with Jesus. It came from a much older Hebrew tradition, a tradition that saw all of creation as a sacred text, a text that, if you knew how to read it, revealed something about the mind of the Creator. Solomon, considered the wisest man of his time, spoke about plants from the cedars of Lebanon to the humble hyssop that grows between the walls. And biblical scholars agree on something interesting. That knowledge was not just botanical, it was spiritual. Within that tradition of reading nature as if it were a sacred text, some plants held a special place. Not so much because they had magical powers, but because of the way they grew, their resilience, and what biblical scholars saw in them communicated something. Something about the spiritual principles that the Creator had encoded within them. And there is a plant that appears again and again at decisive moments in the Scriptures. A plant directly linked to some of the most important protection rituals of the people of Israel. The plant is hyssop. And what's interesting is that hyssop doesn't appear in the Bible at random moments. Every time it shows up, something crucial happens. The first major appearance of hyssop is in the book of Exodus during the night of Passover. Moses is instructed that each family should take a branch of hyssop, dip it in the blood of the lamb, and
que con esa sangre los postes de sus puertas. Esa señal sería
a message for the angel of death. Do not enter here, pass by. The instrument that allowed that protection to be extended was the hyssop. Think about it for a second. It wasn't a cedar branch, the most imposing tree in the region, nor was it an olive branch, one of the most sacred trees in Mediterranean culture. It was the hyssop, a small, humble plant, one of those that grow in the simplest places, between cracks in walls and along the edges of roads. So the question is inevitable: why the hyssop? Because hyssop has a very particular property that almost no other plant in the region has to the same degree. Its branches are small, dense, and absorb liquid easily. Then they release it evenly when used for sprinkling. In other words, hyssop is naturally designed to spread, to sprinkle, and to extend a covering over everything it touches. It's no coincidence that it was chosen as the instrument to mark the houses for protection. Now, the second important moment where the hyssop appears happens in one of the deepest texts in the entire Bible, Psalm 51. That psalm is one of the most intense prayers of repentance that exists. And right at the moment when the psalmist cries out to be cleansed from his deepest guilt, he says something very specific. Purify me with hyssop and I will be clean. He didn't ask for cedar, he didn't ask for myrrh, he didn't ask for incense, he asked for hyssop. The plant that once represented protection now appears as a symbol of purification. But the third moment is the most impactful for those who follow Jesus. It happens at the crucifixion, when Jesus was on the cross, thirsty in his final moments. The Gospels say that the soldiers soaked a sponge in vinegar and brought it to his mouth. Do you know what they used to hold it? A hyssop branch. At the moment of greatest vulnerability, of greatest exposure, of greatest suffering, the hyssop appears again. In the Exodus, it saved the people from death. In the Psalm, it purified the repentant soul. And on the cross, it was present alongside the one who bore the suffering of the world. That's not a biblical coincidence. It's a pattern, or a pattern of meaning that the wisdom of the text wants you to see. So a fascinating question arises. What did the Creator encode in the hyssop so that it became the symbol of protection and purification in some of the most important moments in biblical history? There are 4 characteristics of hyssop that function as a true spiritual language. The first one is this: it grows where other plants cannot. Hyssop thrives in conditions that would destroy larger and seemingly stronger plants. It grows in rock crevices, in arid lands, on roadsides where almost nothing survives. The spiritual message behind this is powerful. Divine protection doesn't need perfect conditions to manifest. In fact, many times it appears precisely in the most difficult places, in hostile environments, in seasons that seem incompatible with any kind of growth. So if you're going through a rough patch right now, that doesn't mean you're outside that covering. You might be exactly in the place where the spiritual hyssop grows strongest. Second characteristic, it's small but incredibly aromatic. Hyssop gives off a strong scent, even stronger than much larger plants. You notice its presence before you even see it. The message here is clear. Divine protection doesn't depend on visible greatness. It depends on true authenticity. The scent of hyssop can't be faked, and neither can authentic spiritual covering. People who live under real protection aren't always the most visible or the most powerful by the world's standards, but there's something about them that you can sense, an authenticity you feel even before they say a single word. Third characteristic, their roots are surprisingly deep. At first glance, hyssop looks like a small plant, but something interesting is happening beneath the surface. Its roots extend much deeper than its size suggests, and that's what allows it to survive in conditions that would destroy more imposing plants. The spiritual message here is straightforward. Lasting protection doesn't come from the strength everyone sees. It comes from the depth that almost no one notices, from spiritual roots that go much deeper than what is visible. A person with true spiritual depth may seem completely normal on the outside, but when storms come, when everything superficial is stripped away, that person remains. The fourth characteristic is this: the hyssop multiplies and covers. It has a remarkable ability to spread. When it manages to establish itself in a place, it doesn't grow in just one direction, it expands, it covers. And there's a very clear spiritual message there. The divine protection you receive isn't designed just to stay with you. It's meant to spread through you. When your spiritual field is aligned and under covering, that protection naturally begins to touch those close to you. Your family, your friends, the people who live within your influence. Divine protection always has a collective dimension. Now, there are moments when that protection becomes especially necessary. Seasons when activating it is not optional, it's vital. And recognizing those seasons can completely change how you go through what you're experiencing. The first is the season of transition. Every time you move from one stage to another, you enter a moment of spiritual vulnerability. A new job, moving to another city, the beginning or the end of a relationship, the birth of a child, and the death of someone close. Every time you cross a threshold, you enter an in-between zone. The previous stage has already ended, but the new one hasn't fully settled in yet. And in that transitional space, the protection systems that worked before aren't fully active yet in the new stage. That's why the hyssop was used in the transition rituals of the people of Israel. It was used to cover the threshold, to mark that very space as protected between what was and what is about to begin. The second season is when you feel opposition, but you can't identify where it's coming from. Everything seems to become an uphill battle. Things that normally worked stop working. People who used to support you become distant. Doors that were open suddenly close, and the strange thing is that you can't find a clear, logical explanation. And those seasons of invisible opposition often appear when you're moving in a direction that fear and darkness would rather you abandon. Because there's something curious about growth processes. The strongest attack usually appears right before the most important breakthrough. In those seasons, spiritual covering is not enough.
Lujo es una necesidad. La tercera temporada aparece cuando alguien
that you love is in danger. Spiritual protection also has a dimension of intercession. It can operate on behalf of others. In Exodus, The hyssop did not only protect the person who applied the blood on the door, it protected the whole family living inside that house. In the same way, the protection you develop in your spiritual life can extend to those you love. Your alignment with the divine is not just a personal shield. It becomes an environment, a field that creates shared protection. And the fourth season comes after a moral or spiritual fall. Psalm 51 was written by David after the biggest mistake of his life. It was a moment of deep shame, of inner brokenness. And it's precisely at that moment that David says, "Purify me with hyssop, and I will be clean." The plant that symbolizes protection also symbolizes restoration. So if you've ever fallen, if you've failed, and if you feel that your own mistakes have opened cracks in your spiritual field, that verse is a direct promise for you. Purify me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. The reaction? Restoration of the covering. It doesn't require you to punish yourself for years. It requires something much simpler and at the same time more difficult: to return, to acknowledge, to humble yourself, and to receive what has already been provided. Now then, isn't everything we've explored so far of little use if we don't put it into practice? Because spiritual knowledge that isn't applied remains just a nice theory. So the question is, how do you activate Hyssop principles, the principles of divine protection, in your daily life? There are 4 very concrete practices that come directly from what we've seen. The first is a declaration of spiritual covering. In the scriptures, divine protection was almost always activated through an intentional action. The hyssop in Exodus didn't work on its own. Someone had to act.
Y marcar los postes de la puerta. Hubo una acción consciente. En tu vida cotidiana, esto se traduce en algo muy sencillo, pero muy poderoso. Comenzar cada día con una declaración de cobertura, no una oración repetida en automático mientras tu mente está en otra cosa. Una declaración real. Hay un momento consciente donde reconoces que tu vida, tu familia y tu propósito están bajo la cobertura
of the divine. That statement doesn't magically change external circumstances, but it does change something very important: the inner state from which you face those circumstances. The second practice is constant purification. The hyssop mentioned in the psalm gives us a clear lesson. Spiritual protection requires regular cleansing. Not because you have to live carrying guilt all the time, it's nothing like that, but because there are thoughts, attitudes, and decisions that, if not examined honestly, start to pile up. And over time, they open small cracks in your inner life. That's why one of the most powerful habits you can develop is this: to regularly sit before the divine and ask a simple but brutally honest question: what needs to be purified in me?
no como castigo.
Not as spiritual drama, but as hygiene, spiritual hygiene. The third practice is to actively extend the covering. The hyssop doesn't keep what it receives, it covers. That's its design. And something similar happens in the spiritual realm. One of the most powerful acts you can do when seeking personal protection is to start interceding for others. Pray for the people you love, declare blessings, and spiritually cover your community. Here comes the uncomfortable but powerful part. Bless even those who have hurt you. Yes, I know. It's not exactly the first thing that comes naturally to you, but when you choose to do it, something interesting happens. Something that's hard to explain with logic, but that thousands of people have experienced. When you become a channel of protection for others, your own protection expands. It multiplies. However, before I teach you the fourth practice, there are days when you feel like nobody understands you, when everything feels heavier, and your thoughts get tangled in a loop you can't break. Now imagine having voices that accompany you, that guide you, and teach you while you go about your day. through audiobooks that seem to be spoken just for you. Try Audible free for 30 days. The link is in the description. And let yourself be wrapped up in stories and lessons that support you, motivate you, and help you see your days from another perspective. Or as if someone had prepared every word with exactly what you need to hear today in mind. The fourth practice is to anchor your spiritual life in everyday life. The hyssop didn't grow in palace gardens. It wasn't surrounded by marble or elegant fountains. It grew in cracks, on old walls, on the edges of roads, in the most ordinary places. And that reveals another profound principle. Real spiritual protection isn't built in extraordinary moments. It's built in everyday faithfulness, in that Monday morning prayer when honestly, you don't really feel like it. In choosing on Wednesday to tell the truth, when lying would be much easier. In Friday's gratitude, even when the week was tough. Deep roots are not formed in the big moments, they are formed in the small ones. I want to close with a detail that, interestingly, almost no one mentions when talking about the Gospels. But once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. In the Exodus, the hyssop carried the blood of the lamb to the doorposts to protect the people. On the cross, centuries later, hyssop appeared again. This time, carrying a sponge with vinegar to the lips of the one who was called the Lamb of God in his final moments. The same instrument, two key moments. This time, bringing a sponge with vinegar to the lips of the one who was called the Lamb of God in his final moments. The same instrument. Key moments. The same instrument of protection that freed a people from slavery was present when the greatest liberation in history was completed. And if you have eyes to see it, the message is very clear. The protection that God designed from the beginning was not provisional, it was not partial, it was not temporary, it was complete. And that same covering, the one that runs through the Exodus,
Llega a la cruz y continúa más allá.
is still available today. It's not a protection that depends on you being perfect. It depends on His faithfulness. It's not a covering that is activated only when you deserve it. It's activated when you decide to receive it. And all of this is brought to mind by a small plant. A plant that grows in cracks. A plant that most people walk past without even noticing. And yet the Creator chose it to be present in some of the most sacred moments in all of biblical history. The Exodus, the Purification, the cross. That says a lot about how the divine operates. Not always through what is big and spectacular, often through what is small and humble. What grows right in the places where no one expects to find anything valuable. Maybe that's why this message also speaks about you. Maybe you're growing in difficult ground. Maybe your roots are much deeper than the world can see. Maybe the covering you carry inside has the ability to protect more people than you imagine. The plant that appears in this story was not the biggest, nor the most impressive. It was simply the most faithful to its nature. And that's exactly what the Creator expects from you. Not that you are the greatest, that you are faithful, that you grow where you are, that you belong, that you deepen your roots, that you extend protection to those around you, that you maintain your authentic spiritual fragrance, even when no one is watching. If this message touched something inside you today, leave it in the comments. You don't have to write much. A single word is enough. The one that sums up what you felt. And if you know someone who is going through a difficult time, someone who feels they need protection but doesn't know how to ask for it, share this video with that person. It might be just the message they needed to hear today. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week on this channel, we share messages designed for the real seasons of life. Remember this. The protection is still active. The roots are deeper than they seem. And the hyssop still grows in the cracks. See you in the next video.